Hello, everybody. Welcome to Pittsburgh, to the Heinz Architectural Center here at the Carnegie Museum of Art. And today is the opening day of our new show, The Fabricated Landscape, which has taken a little while to come together. It started in the pre-COVID days, but I'm very happy that it is opening to the public today. And because of the COVID situation, naturally, the architects, unfortunately, cannot be here in person. The architects come from all around the world, as you're going to see in the course of this presentation. And we're able today to visit with 7 of the 10 practices. Here is a view of the large gallery downstairs, in which you see a model by Anne Holtrop from Bahrain in the foreground. And in the background, a very large photo mural of the Taller de Siqueiros, the former atelier of the muralist David Alvaro Siqueiros, in Cuernavaca, just south of Mexico City. The architect is Frida Escobedo. Now, Frida unfortunately cannot join us today, but we do have a good quorum, our complement of the architects who are in the exhibition. Office from Belgium are also unable to join us. They're traveling, David and Kirsten. But I wanted to show just very briefly 1 or 2 images of the architects who we won't meet today in this session. On the top, these are 2 projects, in fact, a kind of pair of projects that Office wanted to include, in part because they date to the very beginning of their practice. And one of the ideas or theses of this exhibition is to show the work of very young architects, as I like to think that one can find the seeds of long and productive careers in the earliest projects by young architects. So in this case, there are 2 projects dealing with borders. On the top, those 3 images is a project for the border between Mexico and the United States. On the bottom, a project for Ceuta, which is a Spanish enclave surrounded by Morocco. Here is, during installation, a photograph of one of Frida's projects. I should mention that with all 10 practices, each practice is represented by 3 projects. So here we have another one from Frida Escobedo. It's a public housing project in Saltillo in the north of Mexico. It's a large modular system that in principle, the building as well as the model is flexible and interactive with the thoughts and concerns of the prospective inhabitants. In this shot, you've seen on the right, you got a little glimpse of the altar that Anna Heringer and her colleagues have made in the wonderful cathedral at Worms in Germany. And in the background, you see 7 gold prints by Gossagawa, the Japanese architect, the 3rd of the architects who cannot join us today. It's 2 a.m. in Tokyo, so he is. I suppose he's asleep at this stage. But these 7 prints are very, very beautiful objects that we acquired for the collection, I think 3 years ago. There are sections through projects that Go considers to be very important. And yes, you can see my cursor, I hope. You can see the smallest of these projects just there. It's a very tiny project. It's for a chapel in Guastalla in Italy. So these are the architects we're not going to meet in person today. But we have this wonderful project by Luisa Lambri, the distinguished Italian photographer who's based in Milan. And she went to visit Go's project in Guastalla, which, as you can see there, is in Emilia-Romagna, south of Milan. And she's made for the exhibition and now for the collection, I'm very happy to say, a suite of 12 photographs that depict the light coming through this extraordinary marble object that's cut using computer technologies to an extraordinarily fine thinness, so that it really is a light machine, I think. So this brings us to the first of our guests today, Maria Lisogorskaya. Maria, perhaps you can unmute yourself. Maria is in France at the moment, but of course she is part of Assemble, the collective of architects and designers based in London. And of the 3 projects that are in the show, we wanted to focus today on this project, Material Institute in New Orleans, Assemble's first project, I think I'm right in saying, in the United States. So Maria, we'd like to discuss with you about the design decisions that you've made as architects, quote unquote, for this project. I think it's very important for our listeners and viewers to know that as well as being architects in the traditional sense for this project, you're also working to develop the curriculum of this new design school. So please, over to you. Let's tell us something about this wonderful project in New Orleans.
Thanks a lot, Ray. Thanks for having me and assembled at the show. Wish I could be there. Yeah, Material Institute, I've been lucky to be involved in that for the last 5 years. And it's still evolving. I mean, it's not really finished. And the work that we've done to date as designers, as architectural designers, has been quite, I'd say, humble and modern. I mean, it's a very small project. It was a kind of renovation of a courtyard and an old car garage building into what is now fashion, textile, workshop and studios. And it's an educational space that is free, tuition free, and kind of allows for scholarships and experimentation in New Orleans. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of decisions that were made that were about, you know, just kind of practically creating space that is really good for working in as a maker and a designer, to have light coming in into what was a windowless building, but also kind of having fun and making a lot of decisions on the fly because of things just work differently there than they do in London. And so adapting to that. And it's still ongoing, like we're still adding stuff to this, to the neighboring plots and to the one we're in now. So it's definitely a project which has been about adjustability, I'd say.
I think
adaptability.
I should mention for our Heinz Architectural Center visitors that we recently did a show of 100 drawings by Lina Bobardi, the first time that I think so much of her work was shown in the United States. I'm pretty sure that that's correct, and I think we can detect a little memory of Lina Bobardi in some of these projects.
Oh, thanks a lot. I mean, that's a big compliment, and you know, we're definitely fans of her work and have looked at it a lot. So,
and so, in terms of the curriculum, Maria, how does that work with the new institution, starting from scratch? The students come and they take classes in very specific beading. I know beading is a large part of what the students are doing, at least in terms of the photographs I've seen.
Yeah, it's complicated. So there's, I mean, I've mainly been involved in the fashion and textile, but there's also music and garden departments that have their own things going on. For the fashion, yeah, it's been quite collaborative. So we've been working, you know, from the beginning, from the pilot phase with fashion designers and and artists who are in New Orleans, in wider US, but also from abroad. So we worked with Demond Melanson, who's a black masking artist, black, you know, Mardi Gras Indian chief. He had a show at the V&A actually a couple of years ago. So he has been focused on kind of bringing that tradition of New Orleans, of the beading into a kind of art and fashion world. Because that's something he's already doing in his own practice, so it makes sense. We worked with Carola Jones in the pilot phase, who's does a lot of natural dyeing. We worked with manufacturers in New Orleans like Noel DDM, but also invited international designers like Kenneth Ise and Faustine Steinmetz. And so since then it's just been evolving in the last 3 years, and it's quite tricky because it's not it's just not a traditional university setup. You know, a lot of people come with no experience or have other jobs or families and can't commit for like a full-time 3-year course. And so we're trying to find ways of maneuvering around that, I guess, and through shorter projects and stuff. So we did, I think one of the things that's exhibited at your show is pieces, you know, kind of the tufting work that we did for Chicago Biennale, tufting down tapestries.
Maria, that's a good prompt.
Oh.
So here it is. It's a little hard to take a photograph because this is Frida Escobedo's screen that shares a space with you. So, but here you can see clearly.
Beautiful, nice. Yeah, I mean, it was a very short project. You know, we were invited to take part in Chicago Biennale, Architecture Biennale, but it felt like, because it was in the US and there's a connection between New Orleans and Chicago, we thought it could be a good opportunity to do a kind of school trip. And so did a kind of tufting focus. And so a lot of the work that's been made for that show was tufted. And we went with the students, we drove from New Orleans to Chicago and kind of set it up together. And it was an experience.
Fantastic. Maria, I love the idea that you've worked in this. It was an old car repair shop, I think, in New Orleans. Was it the old space? I love the way that you're working on a very ordinary building, but developing something very unique and organic. And it's great to hear that the project might expand as we proceed. So Maria, I know you have to go. You're busy there in France. So stay with us as long as you like, but I think we need to move on to our next
Thanks so much for having me.
participant. Thanks, Maria. Next is LCLA. I'm sorry, Anna, I thought I had you next, but we've come to LCLA. So forgive me, Louise and Charlotte, there you are in Oslo. So Louise Callejas and Charlotte Hansson are LCLA office. Louise is from Medellin, Colombia originally, and Charlotte is Swedish. I think that's correct to say.
Exactly.
But now based in Oslo. We actually have shown Louise's work here once before. I should say that for this exhibition, all the architects are considered young in architectural terms. That's to say, everybody is born 75 or after. But in Louise's case, he's been here before. So he started very young. He was in our show with his previous practice, Paisajes Emergentes, in the show Building Up Optimism, Public Space in South America, now 5 years ago, it seems hard to believe, with the project for the Aquatic Center in Medellin. Louise and Charlotte are working at the intersection, I think it's fair to say, of architecture and landscape architecture. And they're showing this project. As you can see, it's called Shapes of the Forest. Louise and Charlotte, maybe I'll pass it over to you to explain your thinking here about the nature and what nature might be in today's world around the Norwegian capital.
Thank you so much. Yes, this is a project that we did a couple of years ago together with Dale Weave, that is essentially about something that we discovered around Oslo, which is this incredibly sophisticated forest that is managed and exploited and has clearings, as there are clearings in many places of the world, but they seem to be particularly beautiful and interesting around Oslo, because the shapes of these forest clearings are very different than other parts of the world, like Canada or even neighboring Sweden, where they tend to be more brutal and squarish. And seems like these shapes are driven by a logic that has been developed through many decades of trying to coordinate how the forest is exploited with some kind of ideal of a forest that looks natural. So it's actually a very simple project, because what you see in screen, it's a 1 to 700 model that we did in wool, where the clearings are slightly corrected or edited to make them more readable. But it's essentially a project to suggest that these clearings could be a network of public spaces around Oslo.
So here we see it in the gallery downstairs. I hope you like it on the wall, Louise and Charlotte.
Yes,
It's very good.
It almost disappears into our linen walls. We're going to have, I hope we're going to not have too many people wanting to, touch or this thing with their shoulders, because it's I think the first occasion we've had a woven model on
wool on linen. That sounds good.
And so I'm very intrigued by this idea that Norway might have different rules for forestry than perhaps Canada, for example. That am I right in thinking that it's more organic than the large maybe cuts, the Cartesian lines we see in other countries running through forests?
Yeah, and that also has to do with that how the forest is used here. Especially those rules are mainly applied to the areas around Oslo, because the forest is very much used as a public space in Norway, much more than maybe in the city in some cases. So when you have that kind of activity out in forest, but you still wanted to function maybe more for not only for forestry, and you want to maintain, but you wanted to both work for forestry but also for public use that wants it to look like a romantic forest. And they have developed those rules of how to cut a forest and make clearance there.
And so in this project, if I understand it correctly, in the drawing in the background, the black pieces are your suggestions for adjustments to the clearings that are in keeping with this idea of an organic forestry?
Yeah, we just discovered while making and modeling these clearings that with slight additions, meaning cutting some trees or even editing some trees, these clearings could almost be like French bosquets, like fragments of a very manicured landscape, even though they are in the middle of a forest. So the additions to these clearings are just meant to make them more readable, because we like them as architects, but some of them are not necessarily completely visible for the public. That it's also a public that might be looking for a kind of forest that looks more natural, and some of them might not even like the clearings at all. So it's also a way to kind of domesticate these clearings. These are also clearings that change in time and disappear, because they are basically an overlap between forestry and the public use of the forest, which is not necessarily compatible all the time, all year.
In this photograph, we also see the photographs hanging from the ceiling, or Yuan Ban's photographs of the house by Gossagawa in rural Japan. It's called Piloti in the Forest. So as it happens, the two forest projects sort of found themselves in the layout for the exhibition. And I might just very quickly mention that the model in the foreground is one by Maria and the Assemble group. It's the Goldsmiths Center for Contemporary Art in Southeast London, which is a former Victorian bathhouse and laundry that they've restored and remade as a contemporary art space. So here we're standing at your model, Louise and Charlotte, looking the other way across the large gallery. And you can see again Anna Holtrop's model on the left. You can see Louisa Lambri's photographs in the background. But we want to come to Anna Heringer, who is in Laufen on the border between Bavaria and Austria, and needs to leave also in a few minutes for an important family function. So Anna, thank you for joining us today from this beautiful space in Germany. We'd like to talk to you about the fabrics that we see here in the exhibition and also behind you, that you have assisted, I think it's fair to say, women in Bangladesh, in particular in the Rohingya camps, to make. So perhaps you can talk to us about this experience and how, beginning as an architect, you've now developed this way to function as somebody who can assist in the women's groups making these beautiful objects for the world.
Yes, first of all, thank you, Raymund, to you and your team to set up this beautiful exhibition. I'm really in awe going through these spaces on screen and how sensitively you composed everything together. It's really beautiful. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna.
Yeah, the women empowerment is something that is really close to my heart. And I've spent such a long time in Bangladesh, more than half of my year, going and coming back. And it's just so impressive how much this garment sector and the textile sector is actually shaping the settlements patterns in Bangladesh. And somehow, I couldn't look away from that situation, and I was thinking, how is it possible to improve the situation of the women in the villages, to enable them to stay with the families, where they can build up their own house, the resources they find under their feet, the mud, the bamboo that is growing all around, and where they have the network, they know each other, they can move around. But they have to go with where the money is, and the money is in the factories that produce our cheap clothes. So I was seeing, as an architect, I'm kind of at the end of my, toolbox. I need to find something else to really have an impact there. And it's the textiles, we together with a team of designers and also the NGO I'm collaborating with, we designed shirts, for example, and other fashion items that can be made completely decentralized, that enables the women to stay there. And then, of course, that happened, this incredible, terrible genocide in Myanmar, where a lot of Rohingya people had to come over to Bangladesh. And, I visited the camp first alone, and then I brought my students from the GST also there, and we visited together the camp. And it is just so, you don't know where to start because there's just so much need. And talking with the women there and seeing that, there is no girl after like 13, 14 years old, you don't see any girls around. You see only boys, men, but the women are invisible in a way because they all have to stay, in this heat, in their tents, in their plastic tents. And then they have all these memories of this genocide. And it was just so shocking. And we were able to visit some of the tents and to talk to some women. And we wanted to give voice to those women, that somehow they're not forgotten and get visible. And through this exhibition like this, you see one of the quotes that they say, where they describe their lives.
Anna, if you just give me I'm going to there we go. This is the next image of the Dipti fabric. So these are the fabrics that are developed in northern Bangladesh.
Right,
and
yes.
In the background there, you see one of Anna's buildings from maybe, I've forgotten, a couple of years ago.
It was 2006. Yeah.
2006, so a very early project.
That was my diploma project.
So you're one of the very few architects that I know of who has actually built their diploma project. So that's fantastic. What a great message, perhaps, for architects who might be tuning in today. So here we see some of the fabrics from northern Bangladesh. And then here we have some details. So Anna, sorry to cut across,
yes.
But I think you were just about to speak about these pieces.
Yeah, that's a perfect picture. So it's on the right-hand side, we were asking children to draw the dream houses, and they, of course, were drawing the houses they left back home, and they ended up in the fire. And so we took some of these drawings and, asked the women to stitch it there with the embroidery. And it was also, it was for them an important thing to be able to leave the tent, to come together, to talk about their experiences and also earn some money. So this was a very important project for them. And, I think if I read correct, we don't do anything for joy. We just pass the time sitting or sleeping. If we do attempt anything, especially in public spaces, we will face scrutiny. So, when you hear these things, then you think, they're just invisible, they're unheard. And through, exhibitions that you're doing, they're giving some voice. And I'm very grateful for this opportunity.
Thank you, Anna. I should have perhaps mentioned at this point that we are planning 3 small publications to go along with the exhibition. The first one is here today. In fact, that's it. And in the second one, we will show we will discover more about the camps in Bangladesh, thanks in part to Tommy Schapper-Cotter.
Yes,
at the GST.
Super helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. I know you have to leave for an important function. So
yes, sorry, my dad's turning 80, so I have to be there.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you. Bye.
We're hoping, by the way, everybody on screen, we're hoping that at the end of these small presentations that you have a few moments maybe to ask each other some questions. So think about difficult questions for your colleagues. This is, we go now to Bahrain, and Anna Holtrop, a Dutch architect who's been living there for a couple of years and is very much embedded in this project, working in Muharraq, a small urban but wonderful old urban development quite close to the main airport in Bahrain. It used to be at the center of the pearl fishing industry, which has been in existence there for, I think, since biblical times. It certainly has that feeling, and these wonderful old buildings are being restored piecemeal, but also new pieces are being added. So it's a very interesting combination the theme of the fabricated landscape, if there is a strong theme, in part is this idea that architects can make insertions and additions and can strengthen projects through, as it were, interweaving new pieces into existing conditions. In this case, this is the house of an old merchant family, quite a grand house that's been made into a boutique hotel. And you can see in the background a new piece that Anna has designed. And here's a photograph that we received just last week of the building under construction, the new building under construction. So I think we'll wait in case Anna joins us. And my thought is maybe he's confused the time, but I hope you agree this is a very beautiful project indeed in Bahrain. Also in Bahrain is this project by Office, the Belgian practice, another of the 10 in this exhibition. On the left-hand side is this photograph, wonderful photograph, a very large print by Bas Prinsen, the Dutch photographer, of the Center for Traditional Music, which is a new piece that's inserted into this labyrinthine existing urban fabric in Muharraq. There in the background, you will see this large curtain that they have made that depict this small building for music. It's literally curtained in a metallic scrim that rises to allow the musicians inside be observed from the streets outside. 7:30 on Saturday evening, should you be in Bahrain. And here in the foreground, we get a glimpse of our next guest contributors, let's say, Mayo from Barcelona. Here we have this large, beautiful model from Mayo that was very kindly a gift to the collection a few years ago. It's called the Grand Interior. I should very quickly say that in the background, we see some photographs from LCLA office of a new house in Medellin in Colombia. House isn't quite the right word because, again, thinking about what a fabricated landscape might be, this is not a house, not a single building, but in fact a set of buildings, pavilion-like projects on that sylvan site. But now we want to go to Mayo, so I'm going to try to see if I can see. There, I see Mayo. Anna and Guillermo, welcome. I don't know, are you both in Barcelona?
No.
No?
Still in two sides of the ocean. I'm in New York.
You're in New York, okay. Okay. Well, welcome. We wanted to talk about this grand interior model, and I wanted to tease out with you your thinking about private space and public space and how these things are changing in the 21st century.
Yeah, this is a piece that we did. We produced initially for 2017 Chicago Architectural Biennial, and later on it formed part of the museum. That we're very happy about that. And it's a piece that reflects, as you see, it just turns visible furniture and interior architecture. And initially, we wanted to reflect on how all those architectures usually have been neglected from architectural history. And for us, precisely, those are essential elements that define domesticity. And that work is related with many other housing processes we have done, which all reflect on how the house does shape the way we live, and ultimately, through that, also generate a lot of biases. And most of our projects do try to dismantle those biases, and through defining spaces that are generic and define equity, and that ultimately the domestic program is not predetermined, and it's always determined through furniture and elements that the users do place. And that's why the model do reflects also about that. It's titled The Grand Interior. It's defined by this landscape of furniture and different interior elements. basically we draw hundreds of apartments and we just erase the walls. And it was very interesting because the visitors seeing just the furnitures, you could realize about how the spaces were without seeing the enclosure. And it's titled The Grand Interior because it reflects also about our contemporary condition in which we live in a world that private and public are being blurred, and the domestic cannot be just classified within what we consider the content of an apartment or the definition of an apartment, but goes beyond housing itself and embraces also the urban sphere. And that's why the model has this kind of endless appearance, because it could grow eternally, occupying any space. Guillermo, I don't know if you want to jump in, otherwise I'm going to do a monologue here.
Well, thanks for the invitation. We're really happy to be in this exhibition. And I think it has become almost a commonplace talking of this grand interior, this infinite landscape, especially since in this pandemic, we've seen how somehow late capitalism has gone into this private sphere and has conquered everything. So there's no more distinction between what's inside and what's outside by means of technology. And probably this model really wants to reflect on how these boundaries or how these limits have been completely demolished in a way. So I think the role of architecture now should be how to challenge that, or how to rethink, how to rebuild those vanishing or blurring borders, which have in a way made no distinction between reproductive labor and other kinds of labor. And probably, I mean, what's the role of architecture in this huge changing world? And probably this is a very small model, but really wants to reflect on a bigger scale.
I have one other image for you.
Yeah, the model.
Oh.
So here we see the model as it was in Chicago 3 or 4 years ago. And of course, I'm intrigued by the way that the mirror picks up the surroundings. So there's something very interesting, this kind of mutation, wherever the model appears, it sort of becomes into a partnership of some sort with the room or the space in which it's exhibited. It's a kind of play, I suppose. And I wanted to mention here the Duchamp reference. So maybe you might just say a very quick word about Marcel Duchamp.
Here for us, the importance of the door of Duchamp, that obviously it's a quite famous piece. We took it from its ambiguous character. So we claim that house needs to be ambiguous in order to dismantle, as I was saying, preset biases, and be much more open-ended, be much more welcoming to wider social realities. And that's why we claim that ambiguity is needed in housing and architecture in general. And obviously the mirror embraces also that condition. So the model changes depending on where it's placed, and it mirrors whatever it's around it. So it's a way also to generate ambiguity through a physical and material element. And the model, as you can picture, it's filled with ordinary and daily life things. So there's no inhabitants pictures, but you see the use through different glimpses and leftovers of, a dish that it has been, used, and you see that there's a leftover, or even, there's that little thing on the bed is a condom. So, you imagine that sexual relation has just happened on that element. So there's a lot of little glimpses that tells also about possible stories.
The conservators have just given this a beautiful cleaning, but I didn't hear about this detail, so I'm going to have to go and check it out.
I mean, it's incredible the amount of things you can find for models right now in the internet. Now, we're really looking forward to see how the actual ceiling is reflected on the model.
So another project by Mayo in the exhibition is the public space system, which I don't have a photograph of, but in a way I think of that as being the corollary or the obverse or the inverse of this project. It's a public space, an urban plaza that has this kind of domestic or almost residential or intimate quality to it, whereas the grand interior has an almost, to my eye, almost like a public, or at least a communal aspect to it. Yeah, I hope that makes some sense.
Actually, yeah.
So from this grand interior, we go to these three towers, and here we have, these are the three towers that visitors to the exhibition see as they enter into our main triple height space, the main entrance. And the three towers are by, as you can see on the left, Holtrop from Bahrain, the tower that's made from gypsum, a 12-story tower piece, using this very organic shape, a kind of memory perhaps of early mise en déroule before it became rectilinear, but certainly very much not a rectilinear plan. On the right-hand side, we have from Mayo the rooms for a discontinuous villa, which maybe you might just say a very brief word about this one, Anna and Guillermo.
Very briefly, as you can imagine, this is again, it's an ambiguous project because it can be a house and a city at the same time, and it's composed by these rooms, which define an endless possibility of compositions. So again, it's a model that invites the visitor to imagine that housing goes beyond the apartment itself and invites to imagine a future in which housing is defined by rooms, which can be add and subtract on demand, and limits to blur with the public and the collective sphere.
And then in the center, we have a model from our next team, Solid Objectives, Edinburgh, Liu, Florian, and Jing. This is the Breed project that they built in Milan a couple of years ago. They're also represented in the show and in the collection, in fact, with this model that we acquired, I think 3 or 4 years ago, of the wonderful museum at University of California, Davis, with this incredible roof that picks up on the landscape that's, I think, at least in my opinion, the landscape that surrounds the campus. The roof of the model is made such that you can look through it and see these icons that represent activities that might go on inside the building, and seem to come alive in a kind of moire effect as you move around the model or move back and forth in front of the model. But the project, Florian and Jing, I think we should talk about today is the project for Mexico, the public housing and social housing, I should say, in León. Jing, when you were here at a lecture a few years ago, you brought up this interesting idea, at least my interpretation of it, that you work on some very high-end, perhaps even glamorous projects, but it seemed to me that a lot of your energy and focus was to harnessing the expertise that you've gained on these projects, and to use them towards more public projects of public good, let's say. So maybe we might talk about this project in León. Tell us a little bit about how it came about, the local aspect to it, and please also maybe tell us a little bit about the inhabitants. I know it's only recently completed, but have the inhabitants been able to respond to you yet?
Right. I just want to also clarify what you said, Raymond, about harnessing the expertise in the, I guess more glamorous and projects that has a little bit more budget to it, to use in less maybe financially extravagant project. is not the intention. Maybe what I was referring to is more about pure economical kind of trade-off that, you know, often we do housing projects or projects that are more pro bono, volunteer-based projects, and kind of putting our own human resources for that. And the reason I'm saying this is that I think we are also gaining a lot of expertise from doing those projects, and that informs how we actually do some of the institutional and commercial project. And some, you know, you learn more about people, occupation, and how city works through these projects. So it's not that the expertise is one way. I think it's the knowledge gained is definitely both ways. That said, I think housing is you know, typology that's very dear to our heart. From the beginning, we've tried that in many different contexts, you know, different countries, many times from the beginning. And we all know that there's a lot of pitfalls in housing, especially when you're trying to do a housing in a country that you're not from or familiar with, because it's so much intertwined with economical models, certain expectations, biases, as Anna already mentioned, that are just culturally so specific and, you know, and very much tied to the reality of that particular time, and also the political forces as well. So frankly, you know, when we got involved in this project, I was kind of a little bit skeptical of, you know, how it's going to turn out. I think thanks to Florian's enthusiasm after 5 years, finally, it took shape in a very positive way. And I think here, maybe rather than focusing on the objects inside the units, I think we always approach the housing more maybe similar to the field of rooms in the city that you can see in this picture taken by Ivan Ban, that it's really one of the higher density, the only high density building in that neighborhood. And it is really a project we're trying, in a bigger context, trying to reverse the urban sprawl that you see everywhere in not only Mexico, but many other places in the world due to the kind of neoliberal development, global development, and the migration of many of the countryside population to the city centers for jobs. So I think, you know, in that larger context, the project is not only about providing housing units, which is also in reality very important for this group of people. But it's also about kind of really how do we stitch together and the broken fabric of the city, and also how do we increase and introduce a new typology or density of housing to a place maybe that it's not previously so used to. You know, the audience is not so previously used to that, and to change that expectation. And I think, you know, the success of this project is, as you said, Raymond, it's going to be really hinged on the city's care for it and its reputation, that repetition into the future. There has to be more sustained effort in continuing to do this kind of project to really bring the entire city into a higher density fabric, so that land use is considered more responsibly, and the habitants' satisfaction, you know, the customer rating is very important, because the more people really enjoy this type of housing, the better chances that this would survive and replicate itself in the city, which is really the goal. Maybe Florian can talk a little bit about the design.
I don't know, Ray, do you have other questions? And thank you again for including us in the show with all these nice colleagues. Sorry we couldn't be there in person in the gallery today, but I will be there on Friday. So I'm very excited to be able to come and see the show. It's nice to see the fragile next to the model that, you know, purposefully we made quite in a glamorous way, right? It is like stainless steel and wood, almost say a Swiss villa. So there was this idea of indeed the relationship between sort of the economics around this were indeed, you know, throughout the project really really significant. Obviously, we tried to make a robust building and not a fragile building. And I think what you see here also are the blocks, and Jing was already alluding to it a little bit. I think this project is much more about labor and work, almost more than about dwelling, in a sense that this is really made for migrant. Like basically, this city is growing. It's the fastest growing city because all the car industry is here, and so now all these migrant workers, not just from Mexico, but actually from all of South America, are also flocking the outskirts of this city, Leon, just north of Mexico City. And so it is about providing housing. So the blocks we developed, initially we wanted to make, because obviously the budget, this is 60 units, and we had $2.5 million of budget to build 60 units. And so everything had to be calculated, and needed to be made sort of fit within that very tight budget. Initially, we wanted to use precast concrete panels. We thought it's easy and efficient. But then we realized very quickly that actually the cost of the machinery and also the distances that it needed to travel and sort of the impact it would have on the project, both budget-wise and also environmentally, and actually labor-wise, it was much more beneficial to actually work with people in the community nearby. And so we developed this block, which is exactly the maximum weight of what a single laborer can carry in Mexico per Mexican law. 17 kilos. And so rather than using, one heavy and expensive crane, we actually work with people in the community to build this building. And I think that that's also a really important aspect, that we sort of, adjusted the design in the process by, understanding how it could be a much more collective effort rather than sort of an effort of few.
Fantastic. Florian and Jing, thank you. I think I overlooked to say that you're based in New York City.
Yeah.
Just by means of a very late introduction. Thank you. That's wonderful, Florian. We're looking forward to seeing you on Friday.
Very good.
And so we will move now from New York City, from Brooklyn, to Santiago de Chile, to Umwelt. Hello, Arturo and Ignacio. You are here, I hope.
Hello. Yes.
Hi, hello. We wanted to show you. Oops, excuse me, too fast. One image of the Ambient 3060 project, the pavilion from a couple of years ago. Here you can see it in the space it shares with Frida Escobedo's it's the other housing project from Mexico, the one for Saltillo in the north of Mexico. And here we have these two beautiful trunk models with a photograph by Nicolas Sanchez and a video from On Architecture. So just to put a little bit of little more context in the exhibition. This is, I would say, one of the projects that there are many projects in the exhibition that are interested, if not, I could use a stronger word, let's say interested in grids. The grid appears in many places. It's in the graphics as well for the exhibition. There's some, to my mind, some flavor of some utopian moments from the late 60s, early 70s. And I should add, perhaps, that we're very happy to say that for the three publications, Emilio Ambas has given us a small fable, a text to set up each of the three publications. So again, a kind of memory of other utopian architectures that are concerned with architecture and landscape. So the project we want to focus on, Ignacio and Arturo, is this one, which is the project for the Atacama Desert. In your case, with Umwelt, I was a little torn between choosing the Atacama Desert and Antarctica. Definitely two of the bigger, more extensive projects in the exhibition. Could you say a few words about this project, looking at the Atacama Desert, and something about ecology? I know, for example, that you often use the word territory or territorial, and I don't know if that's a linguistic quality or if it's a very considered use of the word on your part.
Well, first of all, thank you again, Raymond, and all your team for this invitation. Also, thanks to all the participants today that took time to be here. I think that there's certain things that would be interesting to say about this installation. This was actually, when you told us that you wanted to show this project, that it's actually not a real project, it's a research project. This was for us, in a way, an opportunity to revisit this research that we did almost 10 years ago, and that it was actually, I think, one of the first or the second project that we did with Arturo after we graduated from the master's school. So basically, it's also a little bit complicated, but the installation that we created for the Fabricated Landscape is basically a composite of 3 different pieces. What you see here in first plane is a triptych diagram. Then in the back of this panel, there is a large photograph of Marco Segers, that's a Chilean photographer, that's showing the desert and a very long pipe crossing, showing in a way a certain clash between territory and infrastructure. And in the bottom right, you see a blue text in a LED display that is trying to describe and to list a certain amount of agents or actors that are competing between itself in this territory of the Atacama Desert. So maybe if you could go back, Raymond, the triptych is quite complex diagram. The triptych was originally part of an exhibition that took place in the Chilean Pavilion in Venice in 2012. And it was something that we did in collaboration with another architect and professor that's called Pedro Alonso. And in that time, the diagrams, these 3 diagrams, were printed very, very, very small, I think like this size. So this new exhibition that you invited us was for us a very good opportunity to show them for the first time in the real scale, and to show all of the details of the real scale of as how we thought they should have been printed in that past exhibition. So the idea of this research project was basically to understand, as you said, Raymond, territory as a project, to understand maybe a fusion between the idea of context, but also the idea of ecology in the maybe framed as this word territory, but understand it as a project with architectural tools of representation and also of designing. So we focus specifically in the Atacama Desert in the north of Chile. So as you see, the 3 diagrams are a triptych that try to frame and divide the desert cross-section. Chile has a very characteristic cross-section. In the left, you can see the shore, in the middle, the central plateau, and in the right, the high Andes mountain range. And these 3 specific morphologies of land and of how you say different cross sections of these geographical configurations at the same time receive 3 very specific natural ecosystems. So each of these 3 sections have also 3 particular natural ecosystems, all of them, of course, highly adapted to the conditions that the desert environment presents. And another important idea is that for us was the desert is commonly perceived as vast and an empty place when it is actually a very constructed place. So we wanted to draw that to compress all these different ages that are very maybe apart from each other in terms of distance, and we wanted to make them visible. Also, Atacama Desert is a very important place in not only in Chilean context, but also globally and in economical terms as being one of the largest copper deposits in the world. And that in consequence, it has been exploited basically by international companies for around more than 150 years. Arturo, maybe?
Yeah, and maybe just to finish that, and then also to answer this idea of territory that Raymond was asking, is that here we try to collide all these actors that Ignacio was naming and understand a possible idea of integration and relation between all of these, which now are totally apart and in different ways and perspectives. I think that the idea of territory that we have been working on is very influenced. I remember from a guest we had in the studio we're doing in university, who was a guy from a energy producing company who was working. He was, let's say, on the sustainability part of the company in terms of societal issues. And he was working with local indigenous communities in the south of Chile. And he told us that the first thing they had to do was to have a common language with the people, because at the beginning they started talking to each other, and even if they used the same words, they weren't talking about the same things. And I remember that he said that one of the key aspects of that was this idea of territory, that for him, and after these meetings with the locals, was related to how you use this landscape, or how you use this geography, and not in utilitarian terms. And for example, for local indigenous, it wasn't related to private property. So they used this territory in a much freer way, relating to the different times of the year and the local ecosystems, and not to the way which we understand territory, which is related to order and to private property. So I think that also helped us to understand this idea of territory of a much larger and integrated project.
Wonderful. Thank you, Arturo. Now, Lucy, you have to help me here, but I'd like to see if you can ask each other some questions. We have just a few minutes. I'm going to end with this image, which is the first of the 3 publications. If you unmute yourselves, maybe you can ask each other questions, if you have some questions. I think, Jing, in future, I'm going to be careful about making statements and phrase them as questions. It might be a better way of proceeding. We've lost.
I might have been very unclear, which is often the case. So.
No. I think you're very clear. So, congratulations, everybody. We think the show looks great. Anna, if you're in the United States, there's very little excuse not to come and see this exhibition.
I hit you right. We're going on Thursday.
On Friday.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm gonna take the flights.
Okay. So we have a couple of moments. If you have some questions for each other, that would be great. Or comments. What catches your eye? Were there any surprises? Hopefully no shocks.
I think that what is beautiful about obviously the show is the selection and how pieces are displayed and how works start to dialogue, even if they were not supposed to dialogue. Mm-hmm. And even listening to my colleagues today, it was very beautiful suddenly to listen to Charlotte and Luis talking about form and how that form has an environmental impact, and suddenly Florian and Jill talking about form again and how that has an environmental impact, but with a concrete piece, right? and they do have something in common. And what it's interesting is, on one hand, that form is, precise and repeated and is the same. And suddenly we have this forest, which is filled with very different shapes and forms, and they do respond to the same goal, apparently. Right? That's my question probably to Charlotte and Luis.
Yeah, I think that that's very nice reading. Thank you. We found that there is a deep intelligence in the way that some of these practices engage with landscapes that are managed, particularly the forest, and that intelligence in how to address form, even if it's not necessarily done from a designer's perspective, creates a kind of proto-architecture or seeds for a possible architecture or even landscape architecture. So that's what we are generally hunting for when we are looking at these landscapes, whether it's a forest or the desert. So I like when you talk about form. I think in our case, it's more about these like seeds of what can be a project, regardless of the scale. It can end up be a project that is about editing a forest like this, or a project that is build concrete house. That actually, when you look at the geometries of the drawings of that house, they are similar to that project, and might have been also that these projects happen at the same time. So it's also about the connections between projects that have very different scales, but share some more or less the same geometric concerns. Which is, I have a question actually for whoever wants to talk about it, but also for you, Ray. I think it's interesting how the exhibition is called Fabricated Landscape.
Yeah.
Which for many might imagine projects literally about landscape, but we see houses, we see buildings in different contexts. So I find fascinating that we can still use that word to describe even the deepest interior of a domestic space. Again, for example, the project by Mayo, that is, it's a landscape of furniture. So we are talking about stuff that is architectural, using that term in a quite fascinating way. And I think it's just probably important to discuss why you use that term.
That term. Well,
to group us all.
Well, some people have asked about use of the word landscape, and one or two people asked about fabricated. In fact, somebody thought the exhibition was about fabric, as in fabric textiles and fabric art. And when I was saying to Arturo and to Ignacio, I've long noticed how they seem to like this word territory, or are interested in this word territory, because in English, landscape it can get pigeonholed very quickly. People think of a landscape as a pretty painting of, I don't know what, a cottage surrounded by trees or something like this. And then in more professional circles, I guess we think of landscape architecture as a professional degree and an institution, and all these protocols around it. But it seems to me that so many of younger practices now are working outside the boundaries. Again, that seems like a landscape metaphor of some sort, but outside the boundaries of professional identities. And I think that perhaps is the way that we're moving forward. From my point of view, I can tell you why I think it is, but that mightn't be so. I think, for example, I think there is a very quickly, I think there is a kind of rejection, certainly a hesitancy, not a rejection, of the host architecture phenomenon of large monoliths landing down in unexpected cities, that have very little to do with their contexts. So I think many of the projects in this exhibition are thinking about context, but not in the old postmodern idea of context, which is to mimic sweeping generalization, but is often to mimic the context. Here, there's the idea about, I think with many of the projects, about threading projects into the world. So maybe this is where fabricated comes in. There's, at least in my head, and maybe I'm wrong, but there's some idea about fabrication both being an interest in how to make things, such as perhaps the concrete units in Leon, but also there is, I think, in, for example, Anna Heringer's literal fabrics, there is an idea about the world we live in as having many different components that coexist and maybe augment each other.
But in that sense, so I also was picking up on fabric and sort of fabricating and fabric. And then at the same time, you mentioned the grid, which in some ways seems somewhat contradictory, right? Because it is sort of utopian and it assumes a tabula rasa in which we can project something in. Mm-hmm. So I think it's interesting that both, say, the grid and the more pliable, so to say, fabric, coexist in this show, right? They're basically two different attitudes with regards to, how we can engage the world.
Well, I think the grid is, as I said, there's the grid there's a kind of echo of utopian projects from 50 years ago that perhaps didn't work out. There are very few examples, I think, of projects from the 70s, excuse me, that saw these ideas through. So maybe people, architects using the grid now can be much more canny and more open and less dogmatic about the grid. I'm telling you my thoughts. I shouldn't impose my thoughts on you. So does that make any sense, that a grid can be more flexible than it perhaps might have been 50 years ago?
I think we believe in the pliability of the grid. Yeah.
Okay, pliability. I like that word. Maybe I have to use this word, Florian. I'm going to steal it. Pliability.
Right.
You're going to see it appear soon.
Okay.
I think, Raymond, because you asked me to write something, I was also thinking about the Fabricated Landscape title quite a bit. And we actually use that term landscape and, working as a landscaper, like in the urban context quite a bit from the beginning. And recently during the pandemic, I have done more actual gardening, like working with the landscape more than before, and kind of every day confronted with how difficult it is to work with something alive. And I think there's something implied very much, I think, at least in our work's ambition to, through the work, gain as much knowledge as possible. So it's more about the knowledge building through the process of building and working. And that might be similar to how, in a very kind of superficial, naive way of reading the act of the landscape and working with the natural and the kind of alive, system, is that you have to gain as much knowledge about what's existing and the soil conditions and the climate issues and all of that, and kind of recognizing its aliveness, that if you don't maintain and weed it, it's going to also be taken over by other systems of life. So I think maybe rather than the utopian, right? Like I feel that at least that for my generation to recognize that it's as much about gaining knowledge, not of your territories in that sense, but more kind of your garden and, with how much you can know. And also kind of recognizing that it's never complete, that knowledge, but you have to start to plant something, this constant wrestling with that multiple systems of lives is very interesting.
Any last comments from our?
I would just
Ignacio.
would just to frame things you were talking about, and I would say, I mean, we live in time where certain words cannot maybe reflect or represent certain concepts that are now in constant flux. So, for example, I think the question that Luis made to you, Raymond, is quite interesting, because it's not called the fabricated architecture. It's not called the fabricated, I don't know, several scale things. So it's true that in Spanish, there's a linguistic problem that landscape, it's not the same that you can understand as we could understand maybe as paisaje. I mean, maybe Luis does not agree, and he used that name for his past office. But if you think about the range of projects that you chose, from a very large territorial scale to the minimum domestic small mini object, all of them still configure somehow an idea of a landscape, regardless of its scale. And in that sense, I would say that for the question that you made to us about the idea of territory, is maybe that for us, in a way, the traditional conception of the word architecture has a certain restriction regarding scale, upsizing scale, or even downsizing scale. So in that sense, I think we have managed to use certain concepts that are that for us are more useful. I would say the idea of territory, to understand the possibility of understanding architecture in a large scale, and also understanding the idea of infrastructure as maybe infrastructure being a word that for us we use it a lot between a tandem between architecture and infrastructure, understanding infrastructure as being maybe the physical aspect of something that may allow other things to happen regardless of its scale. You can think about, I don't know, microchip infrastructure or a large cosmic global scale infrastructure. So for us, I think it's a problem also about the meaning of words and what do they represent and allow you, like in methodological tools to understand and to design.
Okay, our time is up. Thank you all for participating. I wish you could be here to see the exhibition. Anna, you've no excuse. We'll talk soon. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Very good to see you all.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.